I now call the Minister for Health and Ambulance Service.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In the last few months, of course, Queenslanders have been subjected to the vainglorious yet ham-fisted spectacle of the Leader of the Opposition trying to rebrand himself, Mr Speaker. We've had the dirt bikes, we've had the stubbies and thongs, we've had him going hard in the front bar of the pub, sipping on the shandies, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, a Leader of the Opposition looking to the past, Mr Speaker, to try and explain to Queenslanders who he really is, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, but all of this really is a sideshow, Mr Speaker, the one real issue which he refuses to deal with, Mr Speaker, and that is his relationship with One Nation, Mr Speaker. The tawdry affair with One Nation is there for all to see. And, Mr Speaker, the latest revelations expose One Nation as a political party, not a principle, but a profit. Mr Speaker, not just content to use the election to line their own pockets, but a party happy to rip off their own members and supporters and candidates in the process, Mr Speaker. Elections are meant to be a contest of ideas and not philosophy, Mr Speaker. Elections are meant to be contests of ideas and philosophy, Mr Speaker, not boiler room schemes to rip off voters on the way through, Mr Speaker. Yet James Ashby and Pauline Hanson are running One Nation as a money-making exercise, clipping the ticket of every voter on the way through, Mr Speaker, because for them, every voter is another dollar that they can find to put in their coffers, Mr Speaker. We are still waiting for answers on who owns the plane, Mr Speaker. The plane used by Pauline Hanson in the last election. She claims it was a gift from a generous benefactor, Mr Speaker. We should all be so lucky, Mr Speaker, which is at complete odds with what James Ashby said, who said he bought the plane. This from a man who said a few months ago he couldn't pay his own legal bills, Mr Speaker. The Queensland public need answers, and they need answers from the Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker, who has kicked the door wide open to a coalition government with One Nation, Mr Speaker. He needs to find courage, finally show some leadership and say he's not an accessory to One Nation scheme, Mr Speaker, to rip off Queensland voters, Mr Speaker. For once in his life, he needs to stand up to One Nation and rule out a deal with One Nation. That is critical to the future of his leadership. He's distanced himself from everything in the past. Wasn't the Treasurer, it appears, Mr Speaker. Didn't do any of that in the last government. That was Campbell Newman. Remember that, Mr Speaker? Not his fault, wasn't his doing. What happened when his staffer was caught out talking to Ashby about a deal? Didn't know anything about it, Mr Speaker. Put it off. Someone else's problem, Mr Speaker. He is like an ostrich with his head in the sand, Mr Speaker. It is not good enough for Queensland, Mr Speaker. He needs to show some courage and rule out a deal with One Nation once and for all.
Thank you. Time. Thank you.